Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, San Francisco's premier author interview program. I'm going to start today with the title of the book because I don't want you to forget it, Angela and the Baby Jesus. And the next thing you mustn't forget is that the author of the book is Frank McCourt. Now, after that, it all gets a little bit confusing because it's illustrated in one instance by Raul Callon, and then in another instance, it's illustrated by Lauren Long. In one instance, it's published by Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers, and in another, it's published by Scribner. Mr. McCourt, what have you been doing?
I have been succumbing to the wishes of the publishers. After writing Angela's Ashes and another book or two, they said to me, why don't you write a children's story? And why don't you write a Christmas story? Because I think one of the things that occurred to them was that Mary Higgins Clark, who you know, writes a Christmas story every single year. She and her daughter now, Carol, they produce this Christmas book every year. And, it should be easy. So off I went and I sat down and I tried to write a children's story and it didn't come. I wrote silly stuff. I tried to write a Christmas story and it didn't work. But then I remembered that in a notebook, that I had the story that my mother told me a long, long time ago.
When you were 7 years old, yeah. I think you say somewhere.
Well, sitting around the fire back in Limerick when I was 7 with my mother and my brother, she would tell these stories. My father was a great storyteller too. There's a tradition in Ireland called the Shanachie. These are storytellers who went around the country, knocked at the door, and you had to let them in, give them a night, a bed in the corner and a meal, and that's all they did was tell stories. And I think that prevailed in every family practically. My mother would tell stories which were personal and warm in emotion. My father would tell stories, a lot of them derived from Irish history or mythology, or he'd make up stories about the neighbours. But he'd never talk about himself. He was from the north, and I think they're more reserved and reticent up there, Belfast.
I see.
My mother would get into family stories and stories about the neighbours.
So this was a family story, and it was repeated, I would guess, over the years, from the time you were 7, which is when I think you say you first remembered it. Yeah. But then would it be told like at Christmas time?
It wouldn't be told. It would be told any time.
Anytime.
There was no sense of the calendar with this story. And we would think about it at Christmas because in Limerick, which had a population of somewhat over 50,000 people, not a city at all by American standards, but it had at least 10 churches.
Oh, my.
And convents. We won't even talk about the convents. And at Christmas time, we'd go around. I was a real street urchin, and I'd go around with my pals, and we'd go from church to church. This is the only entertainment we had. We didn't have the money to go to the movies. We'd go from church to church and look at the nativity scenes, the creche or the crib or whatever you want to call it. And we were always fascinated because these figures of Jesus, Mary, St. Joseph, the 3 shepherds, the 3 kings, and all those animals, they represented something that we knew the story since we were good little Catholics. It'd been beaten into us.
There's nothing like a good beat-up Catholic kid.
To make you love your religion. So we'd go around and we'd look at these, and I used to look at them and see, for instance, in the Redemptorist Church, how splendid they were. They look royalty, the kings, and even the Virgin Mary and Joseph, they all look terrific. But St. Joseph's, the one around the corner from it, they were a little less splendid. My mother became concerned that the baby Jesus, who was just lying there in the manger, they called it, wearing nothing but a napkin. I guess they had napkins in ancient Israel. I don't know. And she worried that he might be cold, so she decided to do something about it, and that's the story.
That's the story, and that was in a way a family story. Yeah. Until your publisher or editor said to you, "Hey Frank, you got to do a children's book."
Even before that, when I started teaching, and all these kids would ask me about my life, I'd dole out little anecdotes and bits of narrative stories. And one of them was the story of Angel and the Baby Jesus. But I don't think it made much of an impression on the kids in New York, because the first school I taught in was Stuyvesant High School, which was about 80% Jewish. And they didn't seem... I said, look, excuse me, Jesus was a Jew. And they weren't impressed by that.
There was a disconnect.
There was a disconnect. So, and but because I was talking about it, I was telling them the story, I went home and wrote it in the notebook, and then later on, when I needed a story for Scribner's, I just dug it out of the notebook and put it on the computer.
Well, a lot has happened since then. Yeah. Angela and the Baby Jesus is now one story, interpreted very differently by two illustrators, and put into two books by your hardworking publisher. And those are the kind of things we're going to talk about when we return.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Angela and the Baby Jesus in all its incarnations. That's the book we're talking about today. Frank McCourt is here to do the talking. The publishers are Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers and Scribner's. And I just want to pursue a little bit further the publishing process here. They were looking to you to do some kind of Christmas book. That didn't work. Yeah. And you had, as any good Irish family would, a storytelling tradition. And this particular story about your mother at the age of 6 doing what she could to warm up the baby Jesus was a big story. Yeah. And so how do all of these important publishing types decide this is it?
I don't know, because when I as I said, I had the story in a notebook, and then I sent it off to my editor, Nan Graham, and she liked it, and I was surprised because it seemed so simple, and I was so used to down through the years. It was lodged in my head. It was almost as deeply embedded in my head as dandruff. So I had it all those years, and then I thought I'd dig it up because I was feeling desperate, not able to write a children's story. If I had written one, it would have been a bit wilder and wouldn't have been what they call appropriate. So they liked it, and then I thought they had forgotten about it. They had it for 3 weeks, and then Nan called me and said, I want you and Ellen, that's my wife, to come down to the office and to look at children's books. I said, why do you want to, are we going to improve Angela and the Baby? No, she said. They liked it almost word for word, as I said, and that's very rare.
That is.
Almost word for word.
Oh, my, is that rare.
So, actually, my mother's name should be on the cover as the author, but she's gone now, so that's not possible. So we went down and looked at this long table in the Simon & Schuster boardroom with dozens and dozens and dozens of children's books, and we looked at one after the other, and I really wasn't too sure of myself. I was a bit lost. My wife is a bit more confident. I don't know what she knows about children's books. I knew absolutely not. So it took 4 or 5 hours, and we sat there, and we narrowed them down to Raoul Colon and Lorna Long. Why? And they're two different...
Very different.
In completely different approaches. This is fascinating to see a story you've written or that you got from your mother illustrated by two different artists altogether. One of the books is for the children. The big one is for the little people, and the little one is for the big people. So the little one, the adult one, is a little more dreamy, but the one by Lorna Long, a little more evocative. And
I wrote down in my note when I finished reading that it makes the tale, to me, a story of the night a little bit. That it's and I don't want to say that it's darker, but it's a story of the night. Yeah. And the other thing about it is Long does not show many faces.
No, he doesn't.
In fact, the only faces I can remember his showing the face of the priest and the face of the police person.
Yeah, right.
The policeman.
Yeah.
Everybody else is either from the back or from the side.
Right, yeah.
And it's as though the result of that, for me, is to focus on the most important person in the story, Angela,
right?
Because you don't see her, and you want to know.
Yeah.
You want to know.
Yeah.
On the other hand, he has that wild spread where the baby Jesus is flying
over the wall,
up toward the stars over the wall.
All the kids love that.
Oh gosh, that's a great.
Because I went to a school this morning in Atherton, St. Joseph's.
Oh, did you?
School, and I talked to kids from kindergarten up to third grade. And the other day up in San Juan Capistrano, I went to an Episcopal school.
Okay.
400 kids in the little red blazers. So, and they see, they're fascinated with this idea of the baby going over the wall.
Going over the wall.
And the illustrations that go with it.
Now, Raul presents the book with what you might call a much brighter palette than Lauren Long does.
There's more energy in it.
Yeah, and reveals more of the look of the people.
Yeah.
And there was a note that said that that he became comfortable with the story when he was able to envision the whole family walking to the church to return the baby Jesus. And looking at that illustration, you can see that there's a great unity there.
They're all
feeling. And
it's very sweet.
Yeah, it's a very sweet thing, and throughout, you get to see the faces, and I got out of that approach much more of the family experience that was involved in the book, rather than Angela alone against the world, so to speak, or something like that. Well, listen, it's been enough discussion about Angela and the baby Jesus. When we come back, you're going to get a treat, because we're going to remind you of what kind of a great writer Frank McCourt can be, and how well he reads his own stuff, I hope. Stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
This is Jim Foster. Today's book, Angela and the Baby Jesus, the author Frank McCourt. There are two versions of the book, one for children, illustrated by Raul Callon, and another smaller version, which is interesting, for the larger people, for the adult, illustrated by Lauren Long, published respectively by Simon & Schuster Books for Young Readers and by Scribner. And before we give you the pleasure of hearing Frank McCourt read from his own book, I'm going to tell you what you have to do. You have to make this book your Christmas book this year, because it's, as we said before, it's a simple story. It's touching, it's poignant, memorable, and it's a story for young and old alike, as Scribner's and company figured out. Now, we're going to start, Frank, if you don't mind, somewhat in media res. You remember that from your teaching days.
That's right.
In media res. And Angela has snatched the baby Jesus, and she's on her way home. And
she stopped. How was she going to take the baby Jesus into her house with everyone gawking and wanting to know who was that and what was she doing? She wouldn't go in the front door. There was a lane behind her house where she could carry the baby over the wall and into her backyard. No, the wall was too high. She could climb over herself, but not with the baby. She talked to him. "Will you help me, little baby? Will you help me?" He did. He told her in her head to throw the baby over the wall and recover him on the other side. That was hard. She threw, and he wouldn't go over till she threw the third time, and over he went. Then the terrible thing happened. When she climbed up and looked into her backyard, there was no sign of him. Now what was she going to do? Where did he go? She was only 6, but she knew how serious it was to lose the baby Jesus. If she didn't find him, he'd be cold and calling for his mother. Ah, there he was, all white in the dark, lying in the backyard of the blind woman next door, Mrs. Blake. Now, perched on the wall, she talked to him sternly. Here she was, trying to help him, and there was no excuse for the way he was behaving, flying around like a bird and landing in a backyard where he wasn't supposed to be. She told him, "Baby Jesus, I have a good mind to leave you there in Mrs. Blake's backyard." But she couldn't. If God ever found out, he'd never let her have a sweet or a bun for a whole week. She told the baby, "When I throw you over the wall, you're not supposed to land in Mrs. Blake's backyard. You're not to be flying around like an angel." She climbed onto Mrs. Blake's backyard and picked him up. This time, in one throw, he went over the wall into her own yard, and that proved he was paying attention, even if he had the same smile. She loved the way his hands and arms still reached out to the way they did in the crib. She climbed into her own backyard, told him he was a good baby for going where he was thrown, and hugged him to warm him up in that cold, dark December night. She nearly died of fright when the back door of her house creaked, and out came her brother Pat, going to the lavatory. He stopped and stared at her and the baby, but she didn't mind because he was like a baby himself and often said foolish things even she wouldn't say. "Is that the baby Jesus you have there?" "'Tis. He's supposed to be sleeping in his crib abroad in the church, and you have him here in the freezing cold." I'm warming him up, she said. "His mother will be roaring and bawling when she sees him gone." "She won't mind. She wants him to be warm too." "All right, so." He went into the lavatory, and she stepped quietly along the little hall and up the stairs. She stopped at the top when she heard Pat's voice. "Mammy, Angela do have the baby Jesus up the stairs." "Ah, no, Pat, love," said his mother. "You have a great imagination. Sit there and have your tea."
And that's all you're going to get from Mr. McCourt today, because that should whet your appetite. That should make you run right out and buy one copy, at least one copy of each version.
Every family has a number of children.
That's true.
And many adults.
Have grandchildren.
And grandchildren.
Grandchildren.
Oh, yeah,
don't forget grandchildren.
And then poor people in the next poor street.
who don't have the wherewithal. The story ends beautifully, and then there are many, grace notes here. There's the notion that Angela being so small, her opinions in the family conversations aren't worth much, and now she's clutching this big secret, and the baby Jesus is upstairs in the bed warming up. I mean, it's great. You've been listening to Frank McCourt to tell us the story of Angela and the baby Jesus, how it all came to be and what's going on now. It's a great book. Please go buy it. It'll improve your Christmas greatly. This has been Conversations on the Coast, and I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter @JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.